Hey everybody, and welcome to Take Heart today. I want to talk about the way in which the gospel brings us freedom. And the gospel brings freedom to all of us, whatever our struggles, whatever our background. But particularly today, I want to speak to those of you like me, who struggle with perfectionism. Now, if you don't struggle with perfectionism, wonderful. That's great and that's good news. But you may well know some people who do. So I hope that you'll still listen today and maybe find it insightful and helpful for friends of yours. But the first question is, what is perfectionism? And there's a book actually called The Perfectionism Book, which is excellent, and it's written by Will Vanderhart and Rob Waller. It's a Christian book, but it defines perfectionism in these ways. See if you recognize this. Number one, setting impossibly tough goals or high standards that can never be practically achieved. Number two, continuing to pursue these goals despite evidence of harm, usually to our own emotional health. And number three, basing our self-esteem partly or completely on whether we have met those goals. So we set these impossibly high goals. We strive to achieve them even when it's detriment to our own well-being, and if we base tremendous amounts of our self-worth on whether or not we measure up and hit the goal. If that's perfectionism. If you are a perfectionist, you probably already knew that. But if you're not, and you recognize that in yourself, you may have an element of perfectionism in you. Obviously, it's a scale. What does it feel like to be a perfectionist? It feels like never being satisfied a lot of the time. Because when we're perfectionists, we tend to focus on those things that we haven't achieved yet, or we haven't done, or we did not very well, and we fixate upon them. So there is a difference between being a healthy high achiever and being a perfectionist. A healthy high achiever is someone who can strive to do things really well. Mike is one of these that I know. He strives to do things to the best of his ability. He leaves it all out on the pitch, but he's able to switch his head off. He's able to go to sleep at night and not think about something that went wrong. He's relaxed. His self-worth isn't tied up with his performance. So perfectionism is more about an attitude to life. And the outworking of it often means that we're not very good at celebrating success. We're constantly on it feels like on game, on performance as it were, on high alert, always striving. And if you get 9 out of 10 in a test, you focus on the one that you didn't get. And that means we end up pretty dissatisfied, and the people that we're dissatisfied with most of the time is ourselves. The gospel brings freedom to us in a way that nothing else can. And all I'm going to say is stuff that I know you will have heard. It's stuff I've heard many times. It's the basics of the gospel, but it's reminding ourselves again that this is truth. And the gospel, one aspect of it is bad news before it becomes good news. Because what we find when we look at ourselves in the mirror of the Bible is that, as if we need the Bible to tell us this some of the time, but is that we're not perfect. And that no amount of striving and straining will ever mean we get there. We're not perfect, and we're never going to be. That's the bad news. In fact, it's worse than we're not perfect. We're actually sinful. Isn't that bad? It's like, it's not just that you're average. It's like that actually we are, in our very heart and being, selfish and sinful. There's all the good stuff as well. We're made in God's image, but that's the bad news. We're sinful. And here is the good news. And this is the sort of stuff that we just got to cling on to because it's golden. Romans chapter 5 verse 6, Paul says, "You see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly." Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. It's the gospel. How does God show his love for us? He shows it by giving up Jesus, his only begotten Son, his very heart, to die on a cross for us. But not only does he do that, he does that whilst we are lost in a fog of mess and of sin and of selfishness. That's the point where he dies for us. So what that says to us is that it wasn't because we were doing a pretty good job. He didn't love us based on our performance. He didn't love us based on our striving or our achievements. He just loved us because he loved us, because he loved us. The gospel is a message, among other things, but right at the heart of it, of the unconditional love that God has for each of us. Now, this notion of unconditional love is alien to perfectionists who think that when I do well, people will love me. It's really, and I'll love myself. It's really hard for us to receive. And what will happen for lots of us is we'll hear the gospel like I've just described. God loves me unconditionally. And maybe for a little bit, we will just absorb it and enjoy it and find a freedom in that. But gradually what happens for lots of us is we drift away and our kind of old thought patterns warp the gospel. And we go from believing when we wake up in the morning, God loves me, to instead believing, God loves me if. God loves me if I do well today. God loves me if I become more like him today. God loves me if I can achieve these things today. We go from believing God loves me to God loves me if. And in doing that, we move away from the message of the gospel, which is no, God loves me. While I was a mess and still a sinner, he demonstrated the extent of his love for me by dying for me on a cross. And one thing that I found really helpful is to ask myself at the start of a day, do I believe God loves me, full stop, or do I believe God loves me if? And if I find myself in that second category, I just have to remind myself again of what this says in Romans chapter 5, about he demonstrated his love for me long before I could do anything that even looked like him or reflected him in any way. I was talking to a friend once and describing what it feels like sometimes as a perfectionist to live life, and I said to him, it feels like there's the actual normal everyday Andy who makes mistakes and has good days and bad days and does well in relationships some of the time and not so good at other points. There's normal Andy, real Andy. And then as a perfectionist, what it feels like is I've got ideal Andy who wanders around, this image I have somewhere in my subconscious, this perfect Andy somewhere. And he wanders everywhere with me. And what he does is he constantly points out my faults. If I parent one of my children quite well, he'll remind me of all the times I've done it badly. Or he'll suggest to me I've neglected the other three. If I do well in one talk, he'll start talking about how my motives were wrong for it. If I forgive somebody for something, he'll point out to me something else I've got wrong with me. It's like relentless. And I remember chatting to this friend of mine, and he said, okay, so you've got the ideal you, this kind of image you have of what perfection looks like, and then you've got the real you. And then he said, which one of those two did Jesus die for? And I remember that question hit me in the heart. Which one of those two did he die for? He died for the actual me. He sees me as I am, and he still loves me. And there's a freedom the like of which I have never tasted anywhere else, that we discover not by going elsewhere, but by coming back again to the heart of the gospel. This is the love he has for us, and it sets us free. And by the way, this is take 129 of this Take Heart. I'm still on a journey to freedom.